Good morning. My name is Diane Dekker, and I'm very happy to be with you here today at the International Mother Language Day Conference and festivities. I work with SIL International as the International Literacy and Education Coordinator, and I'm also a literacy and education consultant with SIL International. Today, I would like to talk to you about mother tongue-based multilingual education and what it means to implement that well. In order to further this discussion of implementing MTB MLE well, it's helpful for us to look back and understand what has happened up until today, and then learn from that, and then think about what we can do as we plan forward to strengthen the program. So when we look back, we have to understand first, why did the DepEd implement a policy based on the learner's first languages? MTB MLE looks at local languages as a priority as language of instruction in the classroom, when historically that has played a very minimal place in the classroom, only as an auxiliary language. But now they're making it an official language in the classroom. So what motivated that? Why did they go in that direction? And then as we understand that and what has happened since the policy began, we can start looking forward and learn from what we have done so far and what we have learned so far, and then plan our next steps. So as we look back, we become aware that there has been over 100 years, over a century of dialogue on this very issue of language of instruction. Out of that dialogue and repeated callings for using Philippine languages in the classroom, several projects have come up, including the Hiligaynon project, the FLCBP project, the Lingua Franca project, and the Lubuagan project, which I will discuss later, as experiments testing whether students' achievements would actually be improved if their first language was used as language of instruction. And each of these projects showed improvement in student achievement. But no policy change came until just a few years ago now. And even until today, there's been only perhaps a gradual shift in ideology. And when I say ideology, I'm referencing the Filipino people's notions of how languages play in their lives and the roles each language plays in their lives. And their preference, their specific preference for English over their own languages, and the underlying assumptions that English is best learned through immersion, or what some scholars call submersion practices. And we will look at how that is. In the mid-70s, you will recall that the Philippine bilingual education policy was put in place as an attempt to bring Philippine languages into the classroom, to acknowledge Philippine values, Philippine culture, and Philippine languages, rather than having strictly a foreign language education system. It also was introduced to strengthen Filipino identity and develop a lingua franca across the archipelago. However, Philippine bilingual education is defined differently in the Philippines than it is in the rest of the world. And it actually introduced two new languages that were unknown to the majority of learners in first grade or kindergarten at that time. And that meant that students who were 5, 6, or 7 years old were learning not just one new language, English, but also Filipino as a new language, because that was often not the language of their home at that time. Since then, more and more students are speaking Filipino as a first language, but that also has its problems too, because it results in the loss of valuable capital among Philippine languages. When MTB MLE was implemented, the premise was that we're starting with what the child brings to the classroom, what they already know. And what they already know are their own languages, their own cultures, and the local knowledge systems. And we build on those things to help them learn what is in the curriculum content so that they can comprehend their lessons, rather than just trying to focus on the words and learning vocabulary that the teacher is using that's not familiar to them. So MLE provides a strong foundation of learning that contributes to learning the curriculum content, learning other languages as well. However, as teachers make this change, research tells us that teacher change comes slowly because it's hard to make changes, and teachers often tend to teach the way they were taught as opposed to the way they were trained, because it takes time to learn new strategies and skills. So as we look back, we need to understand, what is the rationale for MTB MLE? Why did DepEd choose it? And we're going to look at a broad variety of research studies on the topic. We'll start with a global study called the Thomas and Collier study. Then we will narrow in and look at a local study in the Philippines, the Lubuagan study. And then we will consider the research of many, many scholars that point to the effectiveness of using the learner's first language in the classroom. The Thomas and Collier study was a study in the United States looking at 42,000 non-native English speakers in schools in the US. So the common language of the US is English. The vast majority of the population speaks English. It's heard socially. It is used as the formal language of schooling in the US, in the English speaking society. So they looked at these 42,000 students in US schools who were meant to be learning English so that they could actually become at par with native English speaking students, so that they would have equal access to opportunities as the native English speakers. That's the goal. And they compared, Thomas and Collier compared 6 different programs over here on this side. And what the results were of those programs from grades 1 through 11. So they looked at how students progressed from first grade all the way to grade 11, or to the end of their high school years, grade 12. And they compared these programs and the achievements that were made in each of these programs. And what they found was that it's actually the amount of time spent in the mother tongue classroom that enabled these students here to surpass the average performance of native English speakers, which is represented by this green dotted line. So these 2 programs produced bilingual students who surpassed the achievement of native English speakers, whereas these 4 programs down here, transitional and content, etc., through traditional ESL pullout programs, resulted in achievement scores that were under the average achievement of native English speaking students. So in these 2 programs at the top that produced the best results, they used 2 languages side by side in school for at least 6 years, whatever the mother tongue was of the student population, plus English as a second language for at least 6 years. And that produced the best performance. Those students will then become lawyers and doctors and professors and engineers and CEOs of businesses, etc., because of their high levels of achievement. Whereas early transitional programs or English-only programs produce the worst performance. And these students graduated with low achievement, less than the average performance of native English speakers. And so they will not have the same opportunities for work and for additional schooling. So the most powerful predictor from this study was clear that educational success for minority learners comes through the amount of formal schooling they received in their first language. It has to be 6 or more years of sustained use of the L1 throughout their education in order to gain and to sustain the benefits that are gained early on. And if you look carefully at this, these are the grade levels, and it shows that for the first 3 years, all the programs had approximate similar achievement levels among all the students. But it's only by grade 4 that the program started to diverge in terms of the achievement of their students. So early success doesn't necessarily mean sustained success unless the L1 remains there to support and as an active part in the learning process. There are many, many other studies across the world that show the same kind of thing, that students who stay in a bilingual education program or a multilingual education program where their first language is prominent for a number of years are the ones who actually do the best in school. So in Lewagen, we began an MTB MLE program a number of years ago. And when we began the study of the program, we asked ourselves several questions. We were concerned with whether or not the first language as language of instruction would improve the achievement of students. We wondered if the first language literacy development would improve student achievement in school. And we wondered if the first language would contribute to and strengthen second language learning, that is, strengthen Filipino learning and English learning. And would it keep students in school longer because they were engaged in the learning process and they stayed in school longer. So the goals were improved achievement scores, stronger L2 and L3 learning, and lower dropout rates. So if you compare the structure of the Lewagen program with the structure of the bilingual education program, in the MTB MLE program, the content across the curriculum was taught in the first language, whereas in the bilingual education program, content was divided between Filipino and English and is not offered in the first language of the learners. Literacy is developed in the first language first in the MLE program before it's developed in the L2s, whereas in the bilingual education program, literacy is not developed at all in the first language, only in the second and third languages. And Filipino and English are taught in Filipino and English in both programs. That doesn't differ. In the MLE program, the assessment was given in whatever language of instruction was used for that subject area. So math was tested through Lewagen because that was the language of instruction for math. Filipino was tested through Filipino, etc. But not so in the bilingual education. In the bilingual education program, students were tested only in Filipino and English. They're two second languages. And often in the bilingual education program, the L1 may have a space in that program, but it's only as an auxiliary language to help and support the use of the other two languages as dominant LOIs. And so teachers often resort to code switching, which can be helpful for gaining comprehension. But if we look at the history of achievement scores, we understand that it is not nearly as helpful as it should be. And so the bilingual education program, which intended to introduce Philippine languages into the education system, was a start, but it wasn't enough because it didn't include the first languages of all Filipino students. Some important points to make about the implementation of the mother tongue based multilingual education in Lewagen were that we actually spent 6 years working with teachers and parents on advocacy, getting them to think about the issues and to talk about and to understand what the research says about language of instruction and language of literacy. We hosted teacher workshops every year to explore that issue, to explore the research, to begin preparing materials in the L1, begin to develop the teacher's L1 literacy or comfort in their L1 literacy, and to talk about new ways of teaching reading and writing. The traditional ways of teaching reading and writing were to learn the alphabet and then jump into using that alphabet in text, but use of primers and graded readers was what we worked on for a number of years in Lewagen before the program was implemented. The other thing to note too is that teachers were given option to voluntarily implement the program. There was no official start. We just gave them privilege to try it out over a number of years. We did have the permission of the Secretary of Education at that time, Brother Andrew Gonzalez, so that there were no recriminations for those teachers. And then as the community observed the positive results of what was happening in the classrooms of teachers who were experimenting, we decided to initiate a longitudinal study to actually look closely at the achievement levels of students in all of the subject areas over a number of years. So we looked at that for for about 4 or 5 years, taking assessment glimpses each year and not just limiting it to 1 year alone. So the grade 1 research by 2008 is shown here. The yellow bar represents the bilingual education control class, and the blue bar represents the experimental class in mother tongue-based multilingual education. It should be noted that students were assigned to these classes randomly, which is an important component of a strong research project. And you can see that in reading, there's more than 20 percentage point increase for the MTB MLE class. For math, there is more than 30 percentage point increase in the first language class. For Filipino, even though they only studied Filipino for an hour a day instead of in several different subjects, they still improved their understanding and use of Filipino by 11 percentage points. Oh, sorry, go back here. And then Makabayan is the same, well over 20 percentage point increase. And English as well, 20-point increase. And you all know that Filipino parents' #1 desire for their children when they go to school is that they learn English well, because that is what's going to get them a job down the road. These other subjects are kind of peripheral in the mind of the parent. In fact, I once had a parent tell me, you know, my kid can catch up on math and science and Civica and all those things. But if they don't learn English, they're not going to get a job, and that's what's most important. So their overall score increases were more than 20 percentage points. If you take all the grade 1 students in both programs and you put them together to, to rate them all against each other, then you can see in this chart that among the control class program, the vast majority of students were in the bottom 40 of a number of the ranking. Whereas in the experimental program, only 4 students were in the bottom 40 of ranking in grade 1. And grade 2 and grade 3 had very similar results in terms of ranking among students between programs. So the grade 2 results are quite the same, very similar to the grade 1 results. And you can see here the overall result, 56.9% versus 77.8%. So the kids who are learning through their first language in all the subjects, except for the 2 second languages, are doing brilliantly comparatively. And grade 3, very similar results, 53.9 overall versus 75.1. And you can explore these numbers more closely later. But the point is, in the Lubuagan study, we show what kids are actually capable of achieving when their first language is the language of instruction and when they first learn to read and write in their mother tongue. So that's what is possible for mother tongue-based multilingual implementation. But when we consider the recent assessments, we need to consider them in light of all of this research and decide what can we do to strengthen the program. So let's go back first to looking at the Thomas and Collier study. Remember, we determined in this study that those who surpassed mother tongue English speakers in school in the United States had the most amount of time, 6 or more years of time, using their first language alongside English in school as official languages in school. So it's the amount of time that they spend. In the Philippines, how much time do kids spend in using their mother tongue in school? Only through grade 3. And then in grade 4, there's an abrupt switch back to the bilingual education program. So in reality, the Philippine system is actually, the MTB MLE system in the Philippines is actually a early transitional program with content ESL. ESL is English as a second language. So students are transitioned from MTB MLE into the bilingual education program too early after grade 3, and then they continue to learn their English through content, second language learning. And that produces results that are not as beneficial as if they stay in the program for at least through their basic education. So again, we cannot reiterate enough that the most powerful factor in predicting educational success for minority learners was the amount of formal schooling that they received in their L1. Second languages can be acquired fairly well for everyday use within 1 or 2 years, as long as the acquisition process is a meaningful situation. In other words, as long as the second language that they're hearing is comprehensible to the student and they're able to produce responses in English meaningfully, and they gradually improve on their conversational ability in the second language. But when we use the language of instruction of English in a way that resorts in rote memorization because students don't understand what the teacher is saying, that is not a meaningful situation. And so it can be done, but it takes much, much longer than the 2 years where it could be accomplished if the learning was a meaningful situation. So the other point to show is that we have to develop this oral second language or oral conversational ability in the second languages, both Filipino and English, in order to support comprehension in reading those languages. Kids often do learn how to decode Filipino quite early on, and even English. They can learn how to decode English quite early on, but there's no comprehension of what they're decoding simply because the words that they're sounding out on the paper are not part of their oral vocabulary yet. So if we precede literacy in L2s with oral proficiency in those L2s, then their reading will be much improved because they will be able to understand what they're reading. So if we consider what Cummins points out from the research too, is that actually using the first language in the classroom helps students learn new context when that new context is not yet a part of their community knowledge. Things like photosynthesis and things like equations and all of those academic terms and academic content in the curricula may not be normal conversational points in their daily lives. And so that's a decontextualized learning. And so using their first language to talk about those things that are a bit removed from their daily lives makes those things easy to follow and easy to understand. And it supports also learning their second language and transitioning that learning of the content from the first language to the second language. But if we quickly remove students from an L1 based multilingual education environment, and we put them immediately in grade 4 in a bilingual education environment where their 2 second languages are the primary languages of instruction, then their academic content development will be delayed, as well as their literacy in those languages. So we can't, this is another quote from another study where they said that if you begin the mother tongue at the beginning of the educational process, and then within 2 to 3 years, you abruptly move them into the dominant language education system, it will delay that sense of low self-esteem because students are engaged in the learning process and they know what they're learning and they are confident about their learning. But then once they're immersed in the other languages, it's that strong sense of self-esteem will not be sustained. So they will revert back to this assumption that they are not a very strong learner, they're not capable of learning. And we don't want that because that impacts how they interact in the classroom. So let's look at the policy in the Philippines. The current MTB MLE policy that we have in the Philippines is considered a short exit policy. In the blue bars, you can see that it goes from kindergarten through grade 3, where students have mother tongue based multilingual education, and immediately in grade 4 through grade 12, they're immersed in English and Filipino. But a strong and additive mother tongue based multilingual policy where you're adding all of the languages have a part in the education process. The first language is still a primary language of instruction through grade 6. And then in grade 7 and beyond, it's still a multilingual education program. So the first language still has a place, but it may not be a dominant language of instruction. By what I mean by saying it has a place is that it's not banned from the classroom. There's no such thing as saying no L1 here, or this is a Filipino only or an English only classroom, because that first language helps with critical thinking and comprehension and analysis and evaluation and all of those components that are very important, especially in the higher grades of learning. So this is just going to show you a picture of many other quotes that point out that using the mother tongue in school for a longer period of time has proven to be very, very successful in many contexts around the world. And in 2001, Jim Cummins, who is a foremost leading scholar on use of the first language in education, said that there's a massive amount of data showing the consistently strong positive relationships and interdependence between the L1 and the L2 as they are developed in the classroom, not just for non-dominant language speakers, but even for dominant language speakers who are learning a second language as well. That's what he said in 2001. But by 2013, he said, now the amount of research that is accumulated is such that it's not possible to credibly deny the legitimacy of multilingual education for minority and marginalized students. In other words, there's so much evidence that supports MTB MLE that you cannot credibly deny the fact that it is an advantage for students. You have to look at something else. If something else is wrong, if we have the achievement test that we have in the Philippines right now, then something else is going on there that we have to analyze and figure out. We can't just say MTB MLE is not credible in this situation. One important thing that may have happened in some parts of the Philippines, but perhaps not in every community, is the idea of language mapping, so that we understand the languages that the communities speak. We understand the languages that the students bring into the classroom. We understand that some classrooms are multilingual. They're not monolingual classrooms, like in the Lubuagan program, where they all spoke Lubuagan as a mother tongue. And we also have multilingual teachers. And sometimes those multilingual teachers may or may not speak the languages of their students. This makes a very complex situation where straightforward implementation of MTB MLE doesn't fit in every case. But remember, one of the primary points of MTB MLE is bringing in what is inherently Filipino into the classroom, what Filipinos inherently know, what is their culture, what is their language, what is their worldview, what is their local knowledge, bringing that into the classroom and building on that as they develop multiple identities, as they develop multiple languages, and as their knowledge base expands and includes more knowledge from the curriculum. So we need to understand how these all work together to plan well for MTB MLE. So in cases where we have students that represent different languages in one classroom, there are several strategies we can use. We can divide the class into language sections, or if there are multiple sections in the school, we can have one class that focuses on one language and another class that focuses on another language. So different classrooms for grade 1, different classrooms for grade 2, etc. If that's not a possibility, we could have team teaching, where teachers work together and they focus on different languages. So one teacher might be teaching from the front in one language, and another teacher will be working with a small group of students who speak another language, and then they might switch and do the other. Or if that's not a possibility of having more than one teacher in the classroom, we might use teachers who are multilingual, who can move fluidly between the languages of their student. But that means that the teachers have to speak those languages and feel comfortable in moving between those languages. And that also means the teacher has to have access to multilingual materials, not just monolingual materials. Or we could also incorporate parents in the classroom so that the teacher may be teaching through a lingua franca, and parents might be working with small groups of people who, students who speak other languages as an L1 to support their learning in the classroom. The bottom line is that we have to value what the students bring into the classroom. We have to value their cognitive ability. We have to value their languages. We have to understand that their effective development in the classroom is just as important to their achievement as their languages and their cognitive capability. And we have to give them access to additional languages and academic content through languages that help them learn those other languages and that other content. So it's bringing what is inherently Filipino into the classroom that is important. Another strategy, which is being looked at very closely in some places in Asia, is called translanguaging. And this is used among students who actually grow up multilingual from birth. Students who perhaps have speak one language in the home, or maybe even two languages in the home, and then another language in the community, and a neighbor using another language. So they grow up being exposed to multiple languages in their community and their home, and they bring several languages to the classroom with them. So we want to build on everything that they are bringing to the classroom. Remember, start with what the child knows and build on that. So rather than forcing multilingual children to limit their use to one language, allow them to use their full linguistic repertoire. If they want to share something in class and they mix their languages, that should not be a problem, because as they're in school longer and longer and studying all those languages, they will be able to concentrate. They will eventually learn to use standardized forms of languages where it's appropriate, and they will also be free to act like multilinguals who move fluidly between languages. That's different from code switching, which is more of a deliberate choice. So that means that in the classroom, that doesn't mean that the teacher just randomly mixes languages, but the teacher has to be purposeful and strategic in the way they design their lessons and the way they operate their classroom space. Rather than having rows that all face the front, the teacher might organize small groups, put chairs together where language groups can talk to each other when they do small work together or small group work together, so that they're using their languages before they have to present their work in the language of instruction or something like that. So it's welcoming all the languages that the children bring into the class. We can think of translanguaging with a metaphor of windows and mirrors. First, translanguaging mirrors what students are familiar with. They use every day multiple languages, and then those languages are how we access what they know, and those languages reflect what they know inside the classroom. And then when they see what they know being reflected in the classroom, the teacher can open windows to create opportunity to learn new languages and to learn academic content from the curriculum. So some classroom strategies for translanguaging allow the learners to use any of their languages in any form and as it supports their participation in the lessons. Then when it gets to actual writing of assignments and stuff, they might be able to develop their writing in their multiple languages and then polish it by focusing on one language so that they're actually developing strength in different languages rather than just using mixed languages in their writing all the time. Use small groups a lot so that they are able to discuss what they know and discuss what the lesson is talking about before they have to represent their new knowledge in one language only. And encourage those who speak certain languages, like the language of instruction, better to support and help the other students who are still learning that language in school. When you're talking about things, get students to think of the key terms of what you're talking about in their home language. That helps them link the new knowledge to what they already know. And then always provide bilingual or multilingual materials for students reading so that they're reading all of their languages. A learning maxim out of this is that we value all the languages that the learners bring to the classroom. We promote their thinking skills. We promote their self-esteem, which helps them to achieve higher in their language learning and in their curriculum learning. So that's kind of looking back and also looking at where we are right now in terms of strategies for teaching and learning. Let's think about how do we improve implementing MTB MLE well so that we can change the assessment scores that we actually have right now and strengthen what's going on. You are fully aware of all the variety of challenges that exist to implementing MTB MLE well. I will just list a few of the ones that I think are the most important in my perception. They might be different in your perception, but I really believe that Filipinos need to explore their beliefs around languages, around the value of languages for academic use. Filipinos love their own languages. Generally speaking, they love their own languages, but they see them as crucial in the social area because they have been left out of the academic area until recently. So exploring those, where did I get that notion and why do I believe that? And how does that impact my identity so that Filipinos can negotiate their identities? In my research a few years ago, I learned very explicitly that Filipinos attribute their colleagues who speak English at high levels of proficiency as being intelligent, sophisticated, and global. And one of your scholars in the Philippines has said that the common Filipino perception is that if you don't know English, you simply don't know. Well, you know, if we really talk about that, everybody's going to admit that that's not really true, but it is an underlying current of belief or of identity that exists there. And we need to peel the layers back to really explore those and understand that what we know, what Filipinos know, the languages that they speak every day, all bring value to learning in the classroom, and we need to use those things and build learning on that. But it's not going to happen unless we can ask questions about why are we doing MTB MLE, and we can get sound answers from the research so that we begin to develop confidence in our own languages and our own cultural preferences and our own knowledge bases. Of course, a huge problem or challenge is the development of L1 materials. It takes a lot of time. People who have grown up and been reading and writing in second languages, but not necessarily in their first language, need time to become comfortable in using their first language in literacy practices, and then being able to write creatively in their L1 takes time to develop. It can't be done overnight. It can't be done just by one workshop of working on that. It takes quite a bit of time to learn how to do that, to polish your work, to become confident in that, and to remove the stigma that might be there of fear if you share what you've done because of maybe fear of it not being adequate. The other thing that has to happen is a retraining of teachers, not just teachers, Principals need retraining. Superintendents need retraining. Parents need to explore these issues too, so that they're examining their own underlying assumptions too. And they need to understand more what is meant to happen in school. School previously was basically language learning, but really education is about learning how to learn. And we want to facilitate that by using the first languages. So everybody has to explore these issues and think about what they need to change in terms of their ideology and their practices. One common beautiful cultural value actually in the Philippines is what I have called the culture of respect. Scholars talk about it a little bit differently in the literature, sometimes culture of obeisance or something like that, but it's really a culture of respect. We respect one another by acknowledging that those who have a position of authority over us need to be listened to, and we need to follow their mandates because they know more than we do. They have the position and we don't. But sometimes that culture of respect also gets in the way of actual dialogue, talking together, respectful dialogue, not bashing other people for what they're saying, not accusing and not blaming, but saying, I hear what you're saying, but I don't understand it because I thought that, you know, English is the only way for us to get ahead or something like that. So how is using the mother tongue going to help us to get ahead? Or I thought that this is more like a step backwards than a step forwards. And hearing the responses, having a conversation back and forth where Filipino teachers and parents, principals, supervisors, etc., can ask their questions so that they can grapple with the issues around the policy and understand them, and then make changes in their own understanding of the policy, in their own assumptions about the policy, which will then result in changes in the actual classroom practices. Teachers who are not given that opportunity to understand and to have that respectful dialogue will typically implement in their classroom based on their belief system, even if it's a top-down directive to implement MTB MLE. If a teacher doesn't believe in it, they will find ways to implement it only minimally in their classrooms. I have met teachers who said, nope, I don't believe in the policy, so the way I'm doing it is I'm implementing a mother tongue subject, but all the other subjects I am following the bilingual education policy on. That's only because that teacher has not had opportunity to talk to somebody and ask their questions and gain an understanding of why the first language is important. So respectful, mutually respectful dialogue is crucial to moving forward. As teachers are learning how to do this, they have a big learning curve because they have got to unlearn all the ways that they were taught in school and that they were taught to teach in school, which is really based on immersion or submersion education, which has to rely on rote memorization. So changing all of that and learning how to do it the new way, learning how to develop L1 literacy, two, learning how to incorporate local knowledge and local culture into the classroom is a challenging act. Learning how to work together collaboratively as we learn, rather than feeling like it's a sort of a competition and you have to prove that you're able to do this teaching in the classroom. So it takes time to do all of this. It can't be done just after a few workshops. It really takes collaboration at the school level with the support of the principal and the supervisor and the superintendent. So support has to be there at all levels, but the actual grappling has to occur and the learning at the school level. As teachers are given opportunities in workshops to understand these things and to ask their questions, then they're able to move forward and they're able to become willing to learn how to implement MTB MLE. Cummins says that genuine educational reform starts with the choices that teachers make regarding their own identities as educators and the identity options that they envisage for their students. Filipino teachers traditionally took pride in the fact that they were developing an English-speaking country. It was their job to teach the country to speak English. that's what their identity was based in. And now all of a sudden, their previously marginalized languages are being brought into the classroom, and they're told to teach through those languages that were only valuable for social purposes, but not academic purposes. That's a huge switch for them to get their minds around. And that's why it's hard to make the right choice. But also it involves the way they want their students to identify as well, and the identities they want their students to take up, and helping them understand that what they bring to the classroom as a Filipino and of their culture and language is important, and it contributes not just to the classroom learning, but it contributes to global learning as well, because global learning has to include the perspective of the Filipino. If that's missing, then we miss out ourselves, and we don't want to miss out from learning from you and with you. So if we talk about what kinds of training teachers need, of course, they need to develop L1 literacy. They need to learn new ways of teaching reading and writing. They need to understand how their grammars work. They've studied grammar very well in their own education, and they know intuitively how the grammar of their L1 works, but they don't know how to talk about it articulately, because they filter their understanding of the grammar of their L1 through what they know of grammar, which is English based. So they apply the English grammar structures to their L1s, which doesn't fit very well. They have to understand how the grammar of Philippine languages works. And it's a very complex system. It's not an easy one to learn. They have to learn how to develop creative writing, because the old system was focused on rote memorization, because it had to be focused on that because of the submersion component of the system. Then teachers' writing relied strongly on repeating what other people said. This person says that, or even children in the classroom were copying from the chalkboard or copying from the textbook and not writing what they think. No creative writing, not saying, oh, I wonder if I could write a story about going to my grandma's house last weekend or something like that, which is their own creation. So it takes time to develop their own creative writing. And also, teachers often will comment about there's no way to talk about these things because there are no academic terms in the L1. But if you take a step back and you remember that even when you introduce academic terms in English, you still have to explain through prose what that academic term means. So I'm not as concerned about which language the academic terms occur in, whether you borrow an English term or a Filipino term, or whether you find a good term to use in the L1, they all have to be taught. And so that's not an issue, but for some teachers, it is an issue because it's hard for them to think beyond those terms that they have relied on for so long. And how to incorporate local language and culture in the curriculum is sometimes challenging for some teachers. Moving away from depending on rote memorization, choral reading and repeat after me and those kinds of learning activities, and learning new ways of teaching L2 from a communicative, conversational, activity-based way of learning second languages is brand new to teachers and sometimes to teacher educators. And so teachers and teacher educators have to focus on all of these things to strengthen their own teaching. We also need to consider student identities. Do students feel like they are welcomed into the classroom, or do they feel like to be welcomed, they have to learn to express themselves in English? And while they're in the process of learning that, they don't feel like they quite fit because they're not English speakers yet? Or do they feel like they are welcome in the classroom, who they are is welcome, what they know is welcome, the languages that they speak are welcome? They should have that sense of, this is my space, this is where I come to learn every day, and I'm going to learn. And they need to also have this feeling of, I'm able to learn, I'm capable to learn, and not have that fear of failure. But when teachers use languages that students don't speak yet, they become afraid. They are afraid that they didn't understand the teacher's question, and they are afraid that they're not going to be able to produce an appropriate response in the required language because they're still thinking in their first languages and they don't have enough vocabulary yet in their second languages to understand and to respond in those second languages. So helping them use their first languages helps them to realize that they are brilliant learners. They are very capable of learning, and they don't have to be afraid of it. And they don't have to be afraid of trying things in their second languages either, because they're able to understand the lesson and they're able to use their inherent higher order thinking skills, and the teacher can develop those as well. Every child brings those higher level thinking skills. They're at various levels based on the development of the child, but they all bring it. But when their language is denied, they can't access those skills. But if their language is used, they're able to talk about things from a higher level perspective. So we need to strengthen students' identities, and that's what one of the primary reasons for MTB MLE is, to help students feel welcomed and to help them know that they're who they are, who their community is, what languages they speak, and what their culture and knowledge system are, will help them learn well and will decrease their fear of failure. And you can see from these photos, I love these photos because they show kids excited to answer the questions of their students. And this particular photo in the top right hand corner is lovely. It's a first grade photo where the students are actually standing on their seats because they're so excited that they understand their teacher and that they can respond now. They have all kinds of answers for their teacher. So the Lubuagan study shows what Filipino students are actually capable of doing when they understand the language of school. But the Lubuagan program does not show that that is sustainable across the full education, because that program only went to grade 3. So we cannot rely on those results as sufficient to prove that that's enough for Filipino students to sustain their high levels of achievement in those early years. They have to stay in their MTB MLE program at least through grade 6. So Cummins also says, if you want your students to be intelligent and creative and imaginative, you have to treat them as if they are and not insist that they use a language to identify that, because that's where they trip and fall. They are creative, they are imaginative, they are brilliant, but that has to be accessed through a language that they think in and that they speak with ease as they're developing their second languages. This is an important point too. Cummins talks a lot about achievement scores and what helps learners achieve well in school, but he boils everything down to societal power relations. He says, basically, when there is failure in school among minority language students, it's because of rooted patterns in societal power relations that devalue the culture and capital of students and communities. When we only value that global language, which gives us power and prestige and economic status, and changes our lives in terms of our capacity to earn and all of that stuff, when we overvalue that and we devalue our own, that is what hinders actual learning and contributes to school failure. So we can look back at the NAT scores for the last 100 years, and we can say, how reflective are these scores of the actual way that society as a whole has valued Philippine languages and Philippine cultures in the academe. I grant society values Philippine languages and Philippine cultures in the social domain, but until recently, it hasn't had a place in the academe. And when we bring it into the classroom, we are changing that. We are changing those power relations which diminish and demean local knowledge, local languages, and local cultures. So if we're going to implement MTB MLE well, it cannot just be DepEd's sole responsibility. The whole of society has got to get together. They have got to explore their basic underlying assumptions related to languages, and especially language use in the classroom, in the academic world. And then as they do that, they need to consider, what does the research actually say? Rather than what does my experience say? Because if we rely on our own experience, we're going to look at those elite Filipinos who have achieved high levels of proficiency in English, and we're going to say they are the standard rather than they are the exception. What we want to do is look at how can we contribute so that more Filipinos reach that high level of multilingual proficiencies. And what does the research say about getting there? It's not about leaving English out. MTB MLE is a multilingual education program where 3 languages are dominant in the classroom from day one, but it's how you use those languages, it's how you teach those languages, and it's when you rely on those languages for learning new content that is crucial to the program. MTB MLE is not a vernacular program. We have to grapple with all of that. We have to get our definitions correct. We have to look at our identities and our understanding of the policy. And as we reflect on all of these issues that are really internal to our minds and our hearts, then we can begin to deconstruct that coercive power relation that, that signifies that English dominance is all that we need. And we can begin to embrace the development of local languages for local language capital, so that Philippine languages are being developed and valued. And there is capital in those, both social capital and economic capital are being developed in those languages. So if we are looking to education to transform these notions within society, we want to focus on transformed multilingual and multicultural societies. And I grant you, the Philippines already is a multilingual and a multicultural society, but we want to develop confident identities among every Filipino so that they know that they are intelligent, they are creative, they are imaginative, they are capable of learning. And then we want to use their multilingualism inside the classroom, in the academia, not just in the social arena, but also in academia. So that language, those languages are developed academically, and that contributes to developing all of the rest of the languages that they learn throughout their lives. We want education in the Philippines to be truly multicultural and not English-centric, or even English and Filipino-centric, but inclusive of all cultures in the Philippines and accepting of all cultures. And that will enable Filipinos to become even stronger global participants in world society. In order to see that kind of transformation, we have to focus on developing those strong identities by valuing local languages, valuing home cultures, and valuing local knowledge. Not just valuing English, Western culture, Western styles of life, but by valuing what is inherently Filipino and knowing that Filipinos have something to contribute to the rest of the world, that the rest of the world actually wants to know. And in order to develop those strong identities, we have to change the way we teach. We have to have transformative pedagogies that develop oral L1 proficiency, which contributes to oral L2 proficiency. We have to develop L1 literacy, which contributes to literacy in the second language. And we have to build languages and learning on the foundation of the first language, which is what supports all of the learning that goes on from there. And we have to do that for as long as possible, at least through grade 6. Without ever banning the first languages in the classroom. We don't want to leave them out. We want them to always have a place, so that when a person is trying to articulate their thoughts or respond to a lesson or a teacher's question, they have the freedom to construct their response in the language of instruction as much as possible. But if they're missing some pieces there, the teacher doesn't punish them for that, but allows them to insert what they know in other languages, and then uses that as a learning opportunity to strengthen all of their languages. Thank you for allowing me to share with you today. These are some of the resources that I have taken my work from, my presentation from, and you are free to communicate with me further at my email address, which is listed there on the last slide. Thank you very much.